צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, אש לפניו תלך, אש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב שריו. צדק ומשפט, מכון כיסו, so. Ish lefanav telech. Ish lefanav telech. Utilahit saviv tzara. Ish lefanav telech. Utilahit saviv tzara. Hello, friends. Welcome to our fire class this evening. And I'm going to start, as I started our earlier sessions when we were looking at our more elemental metaphors, by just asking us to take a moment and reflect on our associations with fire. What are the properties of fire, and what does fire evoke within us? You can take a moment to think about it and or journal, or just go right into sharing in the chat if you're so moved. All right, so far we have fire as both beneficial and dangerous. Reminds me to be careful. I'm thinking about back when we had our water metaphor. I think it was Alex kept writing wet, and I really appreciated that. Like, we can also include, right, exactly, hot, light, bright. Not nearly as many comments in the chat as there are. Okay, here we go. Now they're coming. Great. So we can see, if we think about what we are coming up with, and you're welcome to keep sharing in the chat, or if you can see the chat, that there's a lot of different associations with fire. And one thing that comes up, at least for us humans, is that fire is often very desirable and comforting when we think when we can control it, when we can contain it, and is very scary, potentially dangerous, threatening feeling when it is uncontained or uncontainable. And I think that in some ways is at the crux of this metaphor that we're exploring this evening for the divine. What is that core that is so potentially beneficial when we harness it, and also so dicey to try to harness, both within ourselves and within the universe more largely. So as we've done in the past few sessions, we're going to read some excerpts from the book. I'm going to give you a chance to journal on some prompts. Can you hear me better than last week? Great. I found my earbuds. And then I'll send you into breakout rooms. So the first excerpt, and I'm going to be looking for volunteers to read, of course, is beginning on page 186 at the burning bush. And I want to just give some context for this, because it's right after Rabbi Spitzer on the previous page describes an experience of suddenly kind of being aware of her own mortal fragility, feeling that there was something that held my life in its hands, a power that could end my life any moment. And she talks about the meaning of the word awe, which I can't remember if I've discussed in this class or if just in Torah study. Frequently, the Hebrew word yirah is the analog, which is not just wow, but also yikes. And the distinction between wow and yikes is something that is not always that easily definable. It's a very fine line. So, so we're looking now at this metaphor of the something that is both deeply inspiring and also terrifying. So let's read from At the Burning Bush on page 186 to the end of that section, Experiencing the Divine, on the opposite page. Can I have a volunteer who's willing to do that reading? Please, Nina, thank you.
At the burning bush, once he realized that Hashem is speaking to him, Moses hides his face, for he was afraid to look at God. When the Israelites encounter God at Mount Sinai, the Torah emphasizes the people's fear when they hear the divine voice speaking out of the fire on the mountain. Let us not die then, they say, for this great fire will consume us. Later in the Torah, we read a story about Aaron's sons Nadav and Abihu, who are priests in charge of the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary in the wilderness. For some reason, Nadav and Abihu make an unauthorized offering at the altar of the Mishkan. Suddenly, a fire came forth from Hashem and consumed them, and they died before Hashem. There is much debate about what, if anything, Nadav and Abihu did wrong. Whatever the explanation, the main point of the story seems to be that any misstep when in God's presence can mean being swallowed up by the divine fire. While almost anything can be dangerous in excess, the distance between warming your hands by a fire and singeing your fingers is a matter of inches. Fire is essential to human civilization, whether as a source of heat or a means of cooking food. The Torah itself is described by the early rabbis as black fire written on white fire. Yet, alongside its vital, life-giving aspects, The destructive power of fire is ever present. Fire as warmth, light, and protection, and fire as that which annihilates. The complex nature of this metaphor invites us to explore some of the most fraught and challenging aspects of experiencing the divine.
Thank you for reading, Nina. So we talked in an earlier class, I can't remember if it was the water metaphor about, or the place metaphor. I think it was in the place metaphor where, one person pointed out that metaphor is hard when you're in a bad place. And then someone else pointed out, well, then we're only saying that the divine is associated with good or easy things. And that's problematic too. And I think this fire metaphor kind of gets us closer to poking at and dismantling that binary of like good and easy things are where we find, our God and our divine in our lives, and hard, bad things are not. There is some great power in the universe that is not always easy, that can be very scary, that can be very dangerous. And so I invite you, in light of this passage that shows that going all the way back to our greatest prophets who had encounters with this great power and whose first response was, this is terrifying, to reflect on how the experience of fear and or danger relates to experiences you've had of awe and, or I dare say, even of holiness. So that is the prompt, and I'm putting it in the chat as well. If you would like to look at it a little more, and I'll give you a couple minutes to journal on that question before we move on. Sorry, I've been talking and muted. I hope this time has been enough for you to get some thoughts out for your sharing for later. And I want to share a non-metaphorical experience of this metaphor personally. I was in 2011, I was completing a wilderness Torah training with Rabbi Mike Cummins. Some of you might be familiar with his work. He wrote the book Wilderness Torah, and he wrote the book Making Prayer Real. And as part of the end of this training, we did a 4-day wilderness solo. I told a story about this a couple weeks ago when I told about yelling at God and somebody else yelling back at me and me being so frustrated. So this is the same 4 days. And but at a different point on that wilderness solo, there was a lightning storm at night, and I was camped in a little bit of a clearing, so I left the clearing to get under the shelter of some scrubby trees, thinking it was not going to be a place where lightning was likely to be striking right there, and it didn't. I lived to tell the tale, but it struck very close. I mean, there was no counting seconds between the lightning strikes and the thunder. Lightning was striking all around me, and I remember it was such an interesting visceral feeling that I was happening, because I was so aware I could die in this lightning storm right now. And there was a part of my brain that was terrified that I was going to die. And then there was also a part of my brain that was like fascinated. There was a part of my brain that was saying, oh, people will say this was such a stupid way to die. But if I die here, it's also such a glorious way to die. And I know it sounds very silly to say. I see some of you laughing, but all of that was sort of happening in my psyche simultaneously, a certain terror and also fascination of, here I am in this extraordinarily primal moment at the mercy of these very powerful elements. What a glorious way to go if I do. I'm glad that I didn't. It's not an easy feeling to reaccess, but I think, as we think about this, I encourage us to think not only in terms of metaphors, but in terms of real, physical risks, moments of real physical unsafety. That said, I also really appreciate what Sheva put in the chat about, how we access this sense whenever we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. I think I'll move us along to our next segment. We can have some out loud sharing later. So we're going to go to page 188. And again, I'm going to just give a little bit of context because this chapter is very ambitious, and so it's hard to pick segments that entirely stand on their own. Rabbi Spitzer talks about the word kan'ah, which in the human realm refers to jealousy. So it's a phrase that is used to describe, in this week's Parsha, the relationship of Joseph's brothers to Joseph. In modern Hebrew, the phrase referring to sibling rivalry is kinat achim. However, what Rabbi Spitzer is introducing in this segment we're going to look at is a scholarly understanding that suggests that when we read this word as applied to God, we shouldn't read it as presuming that God has a human emotion akin to jealousy, but as an entirely different concept, which may or may not be helpful to some of us. So for the first and I think only time in this course, I'm going to have our reading pick up in the middle of a paragraph near the bottom of page 188. At the very last syllable of the fourth line up from the bottom, starting with the name Nisim Amzalag. And we'll read about Nisim Amzalag's hypothesis from the bottom of page 188 to the question mark near the bottom of page 189, God's consuming fire. So can I have a volunteer to read that segment? Thank you, Julie. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Nisam Amzalag of Ben Gurion University posits the Kana. Is it Kana? How do you pronounce it? Kana?
Kan'ah.
Kana.
Kan'ah.
Say it again. Say it again.
Kan'ah. Emphasis on the second syllable.
Kana is not a divine version of jealousy, but is rather an essential attribute of Hashem that is likened to the intense heat, fire, and lava flows of volcanoes. All of these images are connected, he suggests, to the ancient metallurgical process of furnace remelting. In this process, a corroded copper object was completely melted down in a furnace, and the molten metal was then shaped into something new. In the ancient world, it was not uncommon for divine beings to be associated with metallurgy, with the intense transformative power of flame and heat. Amzalag concludes, the divine Kana was not viewed by the Israelites simply as the destructive expression of anger by God. Precisely as in furnace remelting, it was conceived as the wonder leading to a complete rejuvenation of creation through a massive deconstruction of shape. Divine Kina, as a power akin to furnace remelting, is both destructive and creative, completely reshaping one thing into another. How might understanding Kana as furnace remelting gives us insight into biblical texts about divine anger and God's consuming fire?
Thank you, Julie, for reading that. And her next 2 pages give some examples of where that shows up. And we're going to pick up and keep reading, a little bit of a long reading. At the paragraph beginning at the bottom of page 191 and going to the bottom of page 193. So I needed a volunteer who is willing to take on a slightly longer reading. Emily, go ahead. Thank you.
I first studied these texts about the fiery divine Kana with my congregants in June 2020, as protests in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd were erupting in cities across America. A holy anger, accompanied by actual fire, blazed in those protests. Like the consuming fire of Hashem, once the fires of the protests were unleashed, they could not be easily controlled. The fires destroyed not just symbols of power like police stations, but also neighborhoods, stores, and institutions. An editorial in The Economist evoking James Baldwin's 1963 book, The Fire Next Time, noted, "The fire this time is burning for the same reasons it has so often in the past, that many African Americans still live in places with the worst schools, the worst health care, and the worst jobs, that the rules apply differently to black people. The fact rammed home by COVID-19 that whenever America suffers misfortune, black America suffers most. A sense that the police are there to keep a lid on the city's poor, even as they protect wealthy suburbs." Janae Osterhelt, a columnist with the Boston Globe, shared her own sorrow and anger with metaphors of fire a few days after the protests had started. "A Minneapolis precinct was on fire, but I saw my people in flames. George Floyd was killed Monday, and no one was arrested. And they want me to care about that burned building with not one officer in it? You can rebuild a station. There is no resurrection for the dead black bodies." Should I keep reading? Osterhelt went on to note that the officer who had killed Floyd was not arrested until the city blazed. She continued, "I hate that the livelihood of business owners is burning, but so are black lives, and we know Americans' love language is money. So when lost profits mount, maybe leaders will look at the hate they give us and reconsider. America doesn't listen, not when you have black skin. But you hear the fire because the heat is loud and the sparks are catching." As the Black Lives Matter movement swept across America and racial attitudes among many white people dramatically shifted, I thought about Hashem's fiery anger and the power of divine Kana. Perhaps, as in the prophetic visions, there are times when profound injustice brings in its wake turmoil and destruction. Collective anger at injustice, like the flames that erupt when Hashem is angry, can get out of control. Yet out of those flames can also come disruptive and necessary transformation. As the calls to redress hundreds of years of injustice against Black and Native American people light a powerful fire in the hearts and minds of so many Americans, this next period in our nation's history will reveal if a true remelting is occurring, one in which the structures and ideologies of racism will be melted down so that something new and better, something truly wondrous can emerge.
Thank you for that reading, Emily. So to recap, she's positing this attribute that is referred to throughout Tanakh as something that is fiery, potentially, if we want to anthropomorphize it, angry, but we could say a necessary purging force to move the world away from evil, to move the world to greater truth. It's a provocative argument. With this example from the Black Lives Matter movement, she's suggesting that it acts through people, but of course we have been suggesting that the divine acts through people throughout this course. And she'll go on to suggest that we all have many versions of this in our own lives. So my question for your journaling and consideration now is, have you ever had a furnace remelting moment in your life? And what characterized or characterizes that? Putting that in the chat. Have you ever had a moment where something was destroyed, was burnt up, and something else that needed to happen emerged? All right, my friends. We're going to look at a different aspect of this metaphor now. The aspect of the fire that needs to be tended, the hearth fire, the warming fire, the one that will leave us cold and uncomfortable if it goes out. So we're going to turn now to page 199. And she talks about, leading up to this, the metaphor of the fire on the altar. And I was very tempted to lead us with a chant about that too, because there's a really beautiful verse about Eish Tamid Tukad al Hamizbeach, a fire shall always be placed on the altar, do not let it go out. And Shefa Gold has a lovely chant to that, but I chose a different verse. But I think that's also a really important metaphor, this metaphor of that fire that needs to be tended day by day so that we can have the warmth and the heat, the cooking fuel. So, and that within it can be a metaphor for the core impulses, desires, motivations that fuel us. So we're going to read from page 199. There are many potential obstacles. Just to the first few lines of the following page. The inner flame to burn true. Fairly short reading. Can I have a volunteer? Go ahead, Barry.
There are many potential obstacles to discerning our holy, burning desire in a culture that does its best to convince us that our deepest desires are for physical things, a new car or pair of shoes, the latest phone or TV, a better body or nicer house. It's not always so easy to locate our desire for something more lasting and meaningful. Some of us get the message that our own deepest desire is unimportant, that we are only meant to attend to the needs of others. It is also possible to get so worn down by the world that the burning desire of our heart feels as if it died out long ago. What is amazing about embers, however, is that they can be banked for a long time and then with a bit of attention and gentle care spark a new fire. Rabbi Yehuda Leib of Ger taught that when the Torah says that the fire on the altar will not go out, this is not only a command, but also a promise. The fire perpetually burning on the altar is a reminder that the metaphorical flame in the human heart never actually goes out. We just need to find it and tend it in order for that inner flame to burn true.
Thank you, Barry. Beautiful. So my question for you to think about for a moment before we go into breakout groups is, with this metaphor, what are the inner yearnings that you keep banked, so to speak, that you try to tend? What allows your inner flame to burn true? And it's posted in the chat if you want to refer to it as well. All right, we read some longer text this time, so I'm afraid I didn't leave you with quite as much time to go into breakout rooms, but I'm going to send you in nonetheless to discuss with each other the answers to any of these questions, and or more broadly, what you find compelling, what you find challenging about this metaphor of divine fire. And I'll send you there now. Welcome back, everyone. Let's take some moments, and folks can unmute, and especially keep yourselves to a minute to share any insights that you are moved to share with the group.
I guess I'll share something. The last question about what are you banking on? If anyone notices or wonders why at my ripe age, I still have long hair, there is a reason. And the reason is that way back in the 60s, I found some values that I just loved. And I've let those values define my life, no matter what my age is. And that's what I bank on as I lead my life, that I lived through that, the Woodstock generation, and I'm proud of it.
We are stardust, we are golden. Awesome, thanks for sharing, Ken. Philip, go ahead.
Well, I'll share a little bit that isn't exactly the topic, but for me, the more I've thought about these questions, I thought that for me, fire itself is sacred, that I can sit and watch a candle or a campfire and watching that the world is transforming in front of my very eyes. Is it itself a rather sacred experience? It happens every time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. One of the dangers of talking about fire as a metaphor is that we don't talk about fire as much as not a metaphor. And fire as a literal phenomenon is quite wondrous enough. It is the visible process of a thing turning into a different thing, while giving off light and heat and steam and smoke. And that's quite a powerful thing to encounter. Does anyone else want to share anything? Okay, go ahead, Alex. You are still muted.
I kept thinking I wasn't going to talk about this because it was too obvious, but I just got a hook into something. I use fire for heat. I make fire every single day. I have to keep my fire stove going. It's a chore. I have to do it. I wake up. If I don't do it well enough at night, I have to start all over in the morning. And I just realized that the folks back then used fire in a practical way, primarily. Fire primarily is not a, beautiful, wonderful, spiritual, you just have to do it.
Yes, beautiful. And even the fire on the altar that we almost chanted about is kept burning on the altar because they're burning things on the altar all day and every day. And it's much easier to keep a fire going than it is to start a fire that you've let go out. And I think that's a very beautiful point to make, that is easy for those of us whose houses are heated by invisible electric or gas contraptions. Very easy for us to forget, which is, when we're talking about this, we're not just talking about something really grand and awe-inspiring, but also something very homely. I'm thinking about how she mentions that many cultures have gods of metallurgy and furnaces, but many cultures also had gods, or more often goddesses, of the hearth. And so by invoking this metaphor, we also remember that there is holy work in that day, like there's holiness in the daily tending to the home hearth fire. There's a very funny book that I have on my shelf. I must have it because my husband grew up in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and it's called "And Prairie Dogs Weren't Kosher," a social history of Jewish women in the upper Midwest. And there's a line in the book about how early immigrant Jewish women who were trying to keep Jewish homes in these small towns in Minnesota and the Dakotas, could just see their work as unending drudgery, or could see the same work as if they were as very exalted, as if they were high priestesses, because they were creating holy homes, and literally and figuratively tending these daily fires that could not be taken for granted. So I think that's a really beautiful point to share, Alex. Yes, Emily, go ahead.
As I was reading this chapter, I couldn't help but think, wow, pretty soon we have Hanukkah and we're lighting these candles every night. And I have an old menorah, and one of my favorite things is just to sit and watch the candles burn down. And I sort of imagine who owned this menorah before me, because it came from Eastern Europe.
Yes, so one of the Hanukkah mitzvot that people don't necessarily know about or pay attention to is not just the mitzvah of lighting the Hanukkah candles, but specifically the mitzvah of lighting and then looking at and not using the light of the Hanukkah candles. And rabbinic texts are very clear. And if you look in a traditional Siddur, the liturgy of candle lighting even includes, right after we light candles, we make this declaration: these candles are in honor of Hanukkah, and we are sitting and watching them in remembrance of the miracle, and it is forbidden for us to use them or to benefit by their heat or light. And that's actually the reason for the shamash. The shamash candle is not just this cute candle that you need to light the other candles. Shamash literally means servant candle, but not because it's lighting the other candles. It's the shamash that is sort of the loophole that allows us to turn off the light and use the light of the Chanukiah to see by, for example, because we're seeing by the light of the shamash, but the lights of the other candles are forbidden for utilitarian purposes. Also, if you care about this halakha, you can't use the flame of one of the other candles to then melt the bottom of the shamash and drip the wax into its holder, which we all do all the time. All of which I mentioned just because it's so different, and usually fire is very utilitarian, and Hanukkah is unique because it's the one time of year. And we don't necessarily think about this nowadays if we light Shabbat candles and they're just pretty, but the initial mitzvah of lighting Shabbat candles was about lighting your fires that you were going to use over Shabbat. So fire is usually really utilitarian, and Hanukkah is the one time of year where we light candles and are just supposed to appreciate, wow, this is really beautiful. Okay, my friends, we're out of time, so I'll let you look in the book or think about your own fire practices, but I will close with just another repetition of the chant, and then as usual, those who want to stay for a little more informal chatting will chat, and I'll see you next week during Hanukkah, and we'll close up our class together. If you have feedback or requests about the final class, please do, as always, feel free to send them to me sometime this week. And may you keep your fires burning. Wrong text, sorry. New share. צדק ומשפט נכון כיסו, איש לפניו תלך, איש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב צרה. צדק ומשפט נכון כיסו, איש לפניו תלך, איש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב צרה. צדק ומשפט נכון כיסו, איש לפניו תלך, איש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב צרה. איש לפניו תלך, ותלהט סביב צרה.